What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Zion 2.0. I'm your host, Colin Morris. Zion 2.0 is a podcast about the future of ideas, the future of society, creativity. Basically, I started this podcast because I wanted to figure out how to design my life in a more intentional way, as consciously as possible. Might as well open source the process. This podcast I don't really have a brand. The brand of this podcast is figuring out what the brand is. This is a process-oriented podcast. And it'll be finished when there's some sort of answer, I suppose. Or maybe I'll just keep questioning. Who knows? People who are regular listeners of the show may have noticed that the past few episodes haven't had any music, no intro. I have some audio clips that I want to use. I want to commission a musician to create an intro that weaves in some audio clips. So if you're a musician and you want to contribute to the show, let me know. Shoot me an email, colin@zionpod.me. Check out the website, zionpod.me. But that website's going to be getting a makeover here pretty soon. I have some things in the works. Right now it's just a podcast. Right now the website basically just hosts this podcast, but it's going to become more. I'm going to start writing and doing some other cool stuff. Okay, enough of me. Today, my guest is Daniel Schmachtenberger, the one and only Daniel Schmachtenberger. I first heard him on the Future Thinkers podcast many years ago, and have been following his work ever since. This man is a polymath of the highest order. The thing that really strikes me about Daniel is his unwavering commitment to his work, and his commitment to not numbing out too, which there's so many ways. You have so many choices to numb out. Like pick your poison. And Daniel's like the best version of the Ubermensch. He's like got a scientific mind, but also has clearly done a lot of spiritual work as well. He's got like this big heart and scientific mind. I was really, really looking forward to this conversation, and did not disappoint. We talk about a bunch of different things. We talk about aesthetics. We talk about public education. We talk about secret societies. We talk about how to keep going, how to not harden into a bitter nihilist when you look out into the world. Yeah, there's like this. There's this section at the end where Daniel just sort of goes off on his own sort of like personal sovereignty stack, and I think I'm gonna pull that clip, and musicians out there, I want you to put music behind it. Calling home musicians. I can write music, but I want it to be somebody who's really fucking good at music. Okay. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Daniel Schmachtenberger. One of the first things I wanted to ask you is, I'm thinking a lot about the role that aesthetics plays in a lot of these conversations about phase transition and game B. And I wonder what role aesthetics plays in your world, because aesthetics is presentation or orientation to beauty, and different aesthetic interpretations or presentations are going to draw different personality types or different dispositions. And I wonder, when you're presenting and packaging ideas and working with certain types and groups of people, what role aesthetics play in your world?
If we think of the Greek triad of the true, the good, and the beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
and we think of that as ethics, epistemology, and aesthetics, something like that, it is fair to say that the true and the good only matter because the beautiful is.
Mm.
That if reality wasn't intrinsically beautiful, if there wasn't something that we found beautiful, that beautiful and meaningful are actually very bound concepts, then we wouldn't care about protecting it or serving it or helping its flourishing, i.e. the good, or even coming to understand it well enough to be able to do that, i.e. the true. So there's a way that there is a foundational experience of the meaningfulness or the beauty of reality before any conception of it that is actually an eminent modality, right? An experience that is not abstraction mediated. that gives rise to wanting to understand it better through abstraction, to then be able to create frameworks of how to make choices in service of that. So that's one part, is if someone doesn't actually have a deep first person relationship with the beauty of reality, their ethics will be off. Their basis for choice will be off. Like that's ultimately where the, and obviously we don't mean beauty as apprehended by the eyeball, but as apprehended by the self, right? Through all of the methods of apprehension.
Mm.
So that's one thought. Another thought is there's this statement, aphorism in the Balinese culture that says the art museum is the sign of a dead culture because they've relegated art to a place. And that in a live culture, humans don't make anything that isn't art. That if you're going to bother converting a part of nature to something other than nature, it's very hard to not make it uglier than it was. Like, nature's fucking beautiful. You should only do that if you're actually adding beauty to life. And of course, that also can include adding function, but they shouldn't be separate. And when we think about the way that all animals are made fit to their environment, the way that environment is affecting all the evolutionary pressures, and then how much we evolve mimetically, not just genetically. And as a result, we can actually make new environments more radically. We can be more radical of a niche creator than other animals. We still want to think about not just the immediate first order function of something we're building, but what is the way that it's shaping the humans who are in it? And what is the way that the aesthetics, as well as the function, are actually shaping the consciousness of the humans and the relationships that are inside of it? And you look at a cathedral, and it's obviously a lot of building work that was not just functional in terms of like being able to have people out of the rain to share a process together, but there is a deeper interior function of the numinous states that become more easily accessible just by being in there, just by the nature of what the architecture does and what the space and the shape does. And if you start to think about so many of the problems that we're looking at have to do with how we make the human built world in relationship with the natural world. And there's so much we think about in terms of closed loop materials economies and manufacturing processes for how the built world needs to be from a non-pollution and depletion of unrenewable resource point of view. But also when we think about how does the environmental psychology of the world that we have built condition the humans in it, that ends up leading to humans building environments of a particular type, and the autopoietic cycle that is. You can imagine the rebuilding of the world from scratch as a consideration, where we're thinking about how do we build environments that are not only integrated with and have a healthy relationship with the foundational environment that they're a part of, but that are also developing the humans in a healthy way that happen to be in those spaces, the humans and the relationships between them. So a couple just initial thoughts on aesthetics. I think you probably more meant, how do I think about the way different groups maybe have collective biases or orientations, and appealing to that? I'm not sure. There's a starting place.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said is beautiful. And that last thread, I think I'm interested in your own personal work and your relationship to aesthetics. Like I think about the way that particular ideas are packaged and presented. There's a choice in there that is the presentation is going to attract a certain group of people and might not attract others. I think depending on the aesthetic presentation. Do you think strategically, like there's in order to make potentially radical, interesting, helpful ideas mimetically valuable, like is there a strategy that's like, can we paint this aesthetic with as broad a brush as possible?
Yeah, I don't know if aesthetic is exactly the right frame for the question I think you're asking, which is how do we communicate either in a way that is as universally appealing as possible or in ways that are relevant and appealing to different groups that might already have different kinds of interests, biases, epistemologies, ideologies, aesthetics, ethics. I think both of those are important. I think trying to communicate things that everyone has some ground experience in, and that if one is communicating from the level of a synthesis of the true parts of more conservative and more progressive worldviews, or any kind of place where there's a branching or difference between worldviews, if one is communicating from a place that has considered and actually feels meaningful empathy and resonance with at least what some of that worldview has, there's a possibility that you have a wider resonance and appeal. And especially if it offers a way forward that people can recognize maybe works for the things that they care about and that doesn't require war with another half of the planet.
Mm.
I think, whenever there are differences between people or groups of people, one can ask the question, are these differences simply preferential, different styles or typologies of being? And aesthetics might be one way of thinking of that. Or is one of them actually better in some universal or non-relativistic sense? Is it maybe a developmental difference? And so this question of development versus typology is also another important topic, because obviously if I'm trying to speak to somebody about mathematics and I'm assuming that they know topics they don't know, I'm just going to lose them. And if I'm talking about shit that is already very basic, we're going to lose them. So that's a developmental difference, right? So how do we speak to audiences in that way? Dave Snowden, who made the Cynefin model, anthropomplexity, talks about adjacent possible analysis for working with different groups of people, and that you can identify for a particular group that has something that makes them hang together as a group, that not all possible worldviews are actually accessible to them from where they're at. There are some worldviews that have too many changes in fundamental axioms, experience base, etc. So you have a particular worldview and you'll have a few worldviews around it that are actually adjacent possibles, meaning in one kind of transform, the group could move to that place. And some of those can be seen as moving in the direction of more sustainable, viable for the planet, less warring, and more possibly increase the possibility space for cooperation with other worldviews, and other ones would move in a different direction. So not all the adjacent possibles would be equally desirable from a God's eye perspective. And so, for instance, if we take a group that holds a fundamentalist interpretation of a religious ideology that orients them towards violence, towards religious warfare or something like that, the idea that they're going to move to a worldview that is either atheistic or pantheistic or recognizes perennial truth in all the world religions is probably not going to happen. The idea that they might lead to be able to move into a different interpretation of that same religion that, say, emphasizes the forgiveness of Jesus more than the wrath of the Old Testament God, or something like that, might actually be an adjacent possible transform. And so it's relevant to see, and obviously they're appealing to the authority of Bible over Quran or the origin of species is going to be more relevant, right? You can think of that as an aesthetic if you want. So I think there is definitely something to being able to speak to people both in a language that they can connect with and towards transitional steps that are actually doable. If one is wanting to do things like prevent war from groups that are otherwise moving in that direction. I think in terms of the preferences of how I've communicated in podcasts and like that, and any strategy of how I choose to communicate. I think it's actually shifting right now. I only started doing public communication in the last couple of years in any meaningful way.
Mhm.
And when I'm talking about the generator functions of existential risk and the need for comprehensive civilization redesign and those types of things, um, I was looking for the people who would resonate with that thinking to be able to see what projects were out there and what people could participate in meaningful kinds of projects aligned with that type of thinking.
Mhm.
So I knew that it was not going to have the widest appeal, but that's because I was not actually looking for the widest appeal. I was looking for people that could understand and resonate with and work on similar topics. And go ahead.
Yeah, there's something about that collective intelligence cohering at the sort of Dunbar level. And I think that could happen in different types of organic networks, like a small group of people creating coherence within each other. And then once there's like some level of collaborative coherence that's established, maybe a next step is trying to orient communication to different Dunbar collectives and figuring out like how to package the communication. Maybe that's when the question of aesthetics and developmental difference across communication comes online.
You're saying, is there a sequence of being able to find some collaborative group that is probably sub Dunbar, where that collaborative group can be more generative than an individual in all of its endeavors, including communicating to other groups?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. This is actually something that I find really interesting and I've thought about a decent bit. Is when I think about examples where civilization took a major step forward in some meaningful way, and not just a new tool got created and everyone could use it, but where worldview, which is harder, actually shifted in some meaningful way, it often happened the way that you just mentioned, which is some usually small group of people who have some shared set of insights and capacities are able to relate in a way that creates a coherence that actually increases um, their collective intelligence and their capacity to do things that influence culture more widely. If we think about the Rosicrucians coming together to make the invisible college that gave rise to much of the European Enlightenment, it was very much a process like that. If we think about the founding fathers of the US coming together to wage a revolutionary war, Declaration of Independence, and form a more perfect union, it was a very similar process.
Mm.
And it was something that obviously they couldn't have done on their own. Even, a subset of five of them couldn't have done on their own. But also, a much larger group of 500 people wouldn't be able to do anything all that meaningful to begin with.
Mm.
We've got, I think, 46 of the 47 signers of the Constitution were 33rd degree Masons, and Enlightenment era thinkers and polymaths and etc. But that was kind of the maximum number that could actually really understand what each other thought, read each other's writing, engage in very meaningful conversation. So it didn't suffer the blind spots of any of them. So it had a collective intelligence they couldn't have accessed on their own, but also you couldn't access the collective intelligence with the type of collective intelligence technology they had with much larger group.
Mm.
Now, specifically, what the criteria must be of such a group in order to be effective is very interesting. And that's a topic we could get into if you want.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say one question that's coming up is I wonder if there's something about like could a modern secret society be moderated through the digital space, or is it there's something really crucial about that embodied spatial connection with other people?
The people can have some digital communication, but definitely not exclusively.
I've heard you talk a bit recently about public education, just holding questions around how to optimize public education for the current moment. I wonder if you want to go down that rabbit hole and maybe talk about some of the big questions that you're holding in that space right now.
So I'll share one frame that I think is a good way to enter thinking about public education. We can see throughout history and every civilization that has been that uh, it seems to be an inexorable process. And when I say every civilization, I don't mean small tribal type cultures. I mean any ones that started building large shared infrastructure. We can see that there's an orientation towards increasing power concentration, wealth concentration, political, cultural influence, whatever, but we'll just bind all those together and say power concentration. And so we'll see wealth inequality get larger and larger, and other types of power asymmetries. And, if you read Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, his data sets said that's inexorable in any kind of market-based system. It wasn't even market. It was any system that has private property ownership. Those who have more stuff will actually do better at continuing to accrue more stuff. Obviously, he was looking at that in general, the kind of interest rates available to private pools of capital grow faster than the overall growth of the economy. So those who have more will continue, even if they don't do anything all that smart, to raise above those who don't. Obviously, those who don't have enough and they go into debt get matriculating interest on debt, and others get matriculating interest on investment or credit. But it's also that people who have more money have more access to better education for their kids to learn how to make more money earlier, better access to financial services, better access to influence media so that other people, and influence politics so that other people, are influenced to support the thing that they're doing, whatever, right? And, his particular data said that you get increasing wealth inequality inexorably no matter what you do to bind it, until it gets so severe that there isn't enough quality of life support for the base, that war ends up happening, and war is kind of a resettling or a evening of the playing field. And then the whole process starts again. And we're just in this kind of cyclic boom bust kind of thing of increasing power asymmetry until it's actually unviable, and then some kind of civilizational collapse. So if we want to not keep doing that, and we want to explore what would it take to not keep doing that, one of the things that we can, a way we can frame this is that those who have more power in an asymmetrical power environment both have the incentive and the capacity to maintain and increase their asymmetry of power. That increased power of whatever kind over everybody else is the increased power to keep winning at power games relative to them, right? Mm-hmm. But we also see that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely seems to also be inexorable for a number of important reasons. The Dictator's Handbook is a good book that illustrates some of the principles of why that occurs. There's a nice cartoon on YouTube called Rules for Rulers. That's an 18-minute condensing of the ideas in that book. But it ends up being the case that to maintain and increase the power asymmetry starts to require active disempowerment of others and disempowerment of masses, so that they don't have the capacity to see what the people who are winning at the power game are doing, and decide that they want to change the overall order. And so that starts to look like changes in education and changes in news, and getting representatives having financially vested interests, and whatever it takes to be able to actually have a population that holds a worldview that supports whatever it is that those who are doing well at the dominant empire continue to want to do. You can actually think about that in every dominant system. While it was dominant, psychological health was usually defined. Psychological and spiritual health and virtue was defined as believing in the goodness of that dominant system. And usually irreligiosity and or mental illness was defined as believing otherwise, right? So if we're talking about in a jihadic population, then being anyone who doesn't believe in the caliphate is an infidel. And if we're talking about during the time of the Crusades, anyone that didn't think the Crusades was a good idea was subject for inquisition or a witch trial or something like that. And I have a friend, Samo Borja, who you should have on the show sometime, who looked at, after the USSR collapse, he actually got a lot of the records that showed how the KGB in the Soviet Union had influenced their version of the DSM. And basically schizophrenia was defined as, their version of schizophrenia was defined as that the first symptom was negative feelings about the state, and there might be no other symptoms for some time, but that was enough to be medicated or institutionalized. You can see that like conspiracy theorist is a term kind of like that, and communist, meaning anything that doesn't support unfettered capitalism, right? We'll have some kind of radically pejorative term. And we can actually look at how, like, for the most part, education is trying to prepare kids to do well in the market and not to be happy, healthy, moral people. And psychology is largely trying to help people be able to keep participating in market dynamics effectively, keep participating in the current world structure. And oftentimes psychology is things like helping people not feel bad about institutional violence. And so you can see in so many new age circles and in psychological circles where someone feels really bad about the state of the world for really fucking good reasons. And the work is to help them accept that that's outside of their control and to see what is in their control, which is basically continuing to be complicit with institutional violence and feel good about it, or to, in a new age sense, focus on what it is they want to create that'll resonate with them, that usually orients towards a vision board with narcissistic near-term personal benefit that makes someone a better consumer. So basically, the dominant system is going to upregulate anything that supports the dominant system. And I'm not even saying this in terms of a conscious thing. I'm saying just in terms of any autopoietic process, right? And anything that opposes the dominant system, the system will downregulate. And so, current kind of drive, narcissism, addiction, consumerism, etc., in service to increasing wealth and equality in a captured and in a not real market, a crony capitalist, but captured kind of oligarch market. That system basically ate religion and ate psychology and ate spirituality, and what it put out was the version of those things that supports that system, largely. I'm generalizing here, but we can see where that pattern is the case. And it also ate education. So if you look at, let's just take the US as an example, because the US was founded upon an idea of trying to have something that was more democratized, not having a nobility or a single monarch or whatever run everything, right? But how do people engage in their own self-governance? Democracy doesn't mean voting. Democracy means a process by which everyone is more empowered to be engaged in the collective governance, right? And there's actually, I don't remember which one, but there's a founding father quote that says voting is the death of democracy, because what it means is we weren't able to come together in a town hall and all discuss what was going on in an effective enough way that we came up with a solution that everyone agreed was a good solution. We had to resort to a vote, which means we couldn't agree, and so we sublimated physical warfare. Since we didn't have a monarch to just make the choice, we sublimate physical warfare with a voting warfare. And the voting warfare has less violence, and we all decide that even if we don't get the thing we want, it's better to keep participating with this democratic system than defect on the whole system and go back to warfare, or require some parent that can keep the kids on the same page, by dictatorial force. And so, we're willing to take some losses. But voting is basically a sublimated way to deal with fundamental disagreements that, other than finding a better solution. Just if you type in founding father quotes on education in Google and just read for an hour, blow your mind, because there's just all of them said again and again, we've given you a republic if you can keep it, and the core of being able to keep it will be a comprehensive education of every single citizen in what is necessary for civic engagement. And what's necessary for civic engagement is a deep knowledge of history, so that we understand what went wrong with Athenian democracy and what went wrong in a Roman republic, and what, like, all of those different things, where the strengths and the weaknesses are, and so we don't stupidly repeat the stuff thinking that there haven't been smart humans that thought about and experimented with this shit a lot, right? Which there has. So we have to study that stuff. If we want, part of collective intelligence is intergenerational knowledge transfer, so we don't restart at scratch. If we tried to restart math at scratch, we'd never get past Roman numerals, right? We get to go pretty far because other people have gone far and there's been a collected body of wisdom. There is a collected understanding about governance. It's mostly what doesn't work well, but that's at least valuable mistakes that don't need made, right? When I say it's mostly what doesn't work well, there's that quote, again, I forget which of the founders of the country it was, but that says democracy is the single worst form of governance ever created, save for all the other forms. Mm-hmm. And I think Churchill also restated something like that. But the idea is saying, like, democracy is actually a pretty fucked system. There's so much wrong with it. It's just less bad than most of the other forms. And what they're saying is we just suck at governance. Like, we suck at having humans human together well and figure out how to make sense of the world and how to share values to inform good coordinated choices. And so I'm interested in public education in service to that, primarily, which is how do we develop humans that can make sense of the world well, that can also make sense of what is meaningful. And so the generation of values and meaningfulness. So I'm going to make choices in service of what, and the sense making of what's actually going on and what will be the effect of a particular kind of action. Because the sense making and values generation inform choice making. And if we want to have governance, which means coordinated choice making, we have to be able to coordinate people's sense making and values generation. So the kind of education they were talking about is you got to understand history. You have to understand, if you're in the US, American politics and how it got to be the way it was and what went into why it was developed in some ways and not others. If you want to change it, make sure you understand it very well first, right? And the history of politics writ large and jurisprudence and whatever, the things that you would need to know to be civically engaged. And we can see that US public education, basically this is non-existent. And we can see that the population isn't civically engaged in almost anything other than voting, not even very well in voting, but almost exclusively voting between, not even voting on issues, voting on representatives almost exclusively. And where the representatives, the campaign budgets that they need and the lobbyists that they have to deal with, both of whom are paid for by financial interests, means that you have an oligarchy operating through the simulation of a democracy. And so it doesn't really matter if it's the left or if it's the right, they need campaign budgets. It's going to come from somewhere. And they can't go against too many financial interests or they'll get blocked everywhere. And to be able to get anything through, they have to go with some financial interests. And the lobbyists are all lawyers that are paid for by somebody. So the whole idea is that a government emerges to bind the predatory aspects of markets, right? Because the market can have predatory aspects like organized crime, like, destroying all of the commons for market purposes. And so we decide we don't want that. So we instate rule of law and a government to be able to enforce rule of law to bind the predatory aspects where there would be financial incentive for people otherwise. But what happens, of course, is then the financial interests do everything they can to try to capture the forces that would otherwise regulate them in a way that would be less profitable for them, try to capture them and influence them in their own benefit, which ends up happening. And so then you get something that is worse than a free market and worse than the supposed liberal democracy. It ends up being a crony capitalist type system. So the idea is, okay, if you in a market, you have this asymmetry of power where those who have a lot more market power can basically continue to rape, suppress, whatever, almost everyone else. So we need to make some other kind of power to check that power. So we'll make this thing called government power that will be elected by the citizens elected by the citizens to be watchdogs, empowered with rule of law and monopoly of violence. But then, of course, who is watching the watchdog to be able to see that they aren't being corrupted? Well, that has to be a comprehensively educated citizenry that actually knows what the fuck is going on and can pay attention and can really be able to do things like public audits and accounting to see, wait, supposedly there's tens of trillions of missing dollars of government spending federally since World War II. Where the fuck is that money? Why are we continuing to pay taxes? Why did we have a country that started by getting rid of, like, that actually fought a revolutionary war to get away from unapportioned taxes, and then weirdly ratified the 16th Amendment to be a taxes on labor and wages, not profit, tax on the poor, to then go into a system where we don't even have accounting and the money's being fucking lost. And like, so, but everyone is just going to be focused on the next presidential election and villainizing someone and thinking that getting their party in matters. And that is the simulation that basically keeps everyone distracted from anything meaningful. So everyone who benefits from that simulation benefits from the population not being educated enough to actually check it. And so there was another quote, I think it was Jefferson, that said, if I could have a perfect government and broken news, or perfect news and a broken government, I'd take perfect news. Mm. And the idea is, if there was perfect news, meaning if everyone really knew what the fuck was going on, they would fix their government. The people could actually create a democracy or a republic. If there's broken news, which means people have no idea what's going on, they can't do anything right. They couldn't govern, they can't organize. So basically, the only thing they can do is be captured by whatever forces sell the most effective narrative. So you can see that since World War II in particular, the public education in the types of humanities like history and the social sciences and et cetera, that would empower people for civic engagement have continued to get cut. And we just focus more and more on STEM education. STEM is awesome, but that's not going to tell me how to see if there's corruption going on. It's not going to tell me how to see if we're repeating governance mistakes that have been made in the past, or see if the coordination processes are right. But it will make people who will be able to make good weapons and generate things that will make more market success. And so if what I want, and so you can see, like, okay, after World War II and seeing how advanced the Germans were because of a better education system, meaning how much better their tech was. And then after Sputnik, we're like, okay, issue of national security, we need people who are very well trained in STEM. So we can kind of rationalize why they'd want to like double down on STEM. But I think that's a part of the story. There's another part, which is so we want to find all the smart people. So let's standardize SATs, tests like that, to find them and then drive them into hyper-specialization where they will be useful to the current system without having the kind of thinking that threatens it. Mm-hmm. And let's not have really smart people go into the social sciences in a meaningful way that questions the dominant system. And so we can see basically institutional decay that's happened in public education. We can see radical institutional decay that's happened in the news and the fourth estate, the kind of media that can inform people. And so you go around and just ask citizens what's going on in the world, and you'll see that the level of sense making that people have relative to the actual complexity of the issues is so many orders of magnitude off. They have no possible chance of civic engagement. The only thing that they can do is be weaponized to be part of an in-group to support some leader. Mm-hmm. Or some kind of dominant narrative. And that's what they are. Almost everyone is an activist on one side or the other that are sure they're right and that use whatever social manipulation techniques to keep the people in their in-group in line and keep the fight escalating against whatever the outgroup is. And there's the simulation of thinking, but there's not actual clear thinking anywhere in that system. So if you recognize that power asymmetries have both the capacity and incentive to increase that power asymmetry, And that if you try to create another asymmetrically powerful force to bind some of those forces, they'll just end up colluding or competing in a way that benefits the upper class against the other classes. Then the only answer is an adequate education and empowerment of everyone, such that they can notice and actually be effective at checking and binding those power asymmetries. And I would say without, like, we're not even in the right universe of doing that currently. And without that, I think there are no answers that don't have strange attractors in despotism and then civilizational collapse.
One of the thoughts that came up as you were saying that is in-group coherence. And right now, the obvious options are simulated thinking on one of two poles in the context of political or civic engagement. One thought I had was the in-group coherence feels really important. It's hard to go at something alone. You know, if you feel like you're working toward the true, the good, and the beautiful, and you don't feel like you have a community of support behind you, people that bring different capacities to contribute to the project, it feels like a lost cause. So one thought I had was this idea of power defection. So somebody that has access to immense choice-making capacity, someone who's accrued massive amounts of wealth and capital in the game A paradigm, somehow getting them to defect on their obvious self-interest and start to basically fund or support an in-group that's interested in these sorts of questions that you have, and have it in the container, at least initially, of a secret society or mystery school. So the ideas are protected from some of those strange attractors that you mentioned.
So, of course, the story is that plenty of people with wealth do philanthropy. And so they're obviously not just focused on their own personal betterment. They're doing philanthropy and clearly using their resources to help the world, including losing some of their resources. That's the story. And I'm not saying that there are no places where that's true. There are some places where that's true. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of places where that's signaled that's not really true. Mm-hmm. So we'll notice how many of the ultra high net worth people that are most well known for their philanthropy keep getting richer as they keep doing more of the type of philanthropy they're doing, which is always an interesting topic. How does that work? And so there's a set of unspoken things in those processes that are worth actually making explicit. So we're at a fundraising gala, and we all paid $15,000 to be there, or whatever it is, for whatever the charity is. We're raising money for water for kids in some poor area, and we all talk about how much we care about this and why we need to unite together to do this thing, or the climate change, or whatever it is. But what's unspoken is, so we are the financial elite that are actually benefiting from the macroeconomic system that is driving these problems. We have investments in hedge funds that invest in military manufacturers that create a false flag incentive for unnecessary war, and we're talking about how to solve war. We have money invested in fossil fuels, or anything that uses fossil fuels downstream, or there's poverty, but we have a system that we know can't not have a power law distribution on economics, and that systemically creates and maintains poverty. And so then the thing that we don't say is, okay, I'm here at the gala donating, and I'm saying that I'm committed to help this problem. But what I'm really committed to is maintaining the privilege that I benefit from of being at the very top of this power law distribution of wealth. And hopefully not just maintaining it, but advancing it. And if I thought my engagement here would not maintain it, I probably wouldn't be here, right? And so, well, how does it do that? Well, I obviously get some social status signaling from being here. I'm continuing to reinforce my relationships with elite in groups that is where the business opportunities are going to happen. And beyond just even business opportunities, let's say we fail at business, we'll just bail ourselves out afterwards. Let's say there's a financial collapse like 2008 and the banks seem like they need to go bankrupt. We can just say too big to fail. Again, use the financial powers to control government forces such that a bailout happens that is totally not a market. And all of the bankers make more money out of taxpayer money that the taxpayers didn't get a vote on. Is that a good thing? Including future generations that are now saddled with that debt. So especially if there's high uncertainty where I don't even know as an elite what to invest in, I at least know that being part of the elite class is the best thing. And so I'm going to do philanthropy in a way that does groupthink on being part of the elite class, as opposed to think clearly about what would actually make it better, which might include looking at the problems of what generates an elite class itself. So I could give a lot more examples. My friend Michael Vassar did a lot to inform me in understanding these type of dynamics where I had been naive to them. And it's important because there's a big difference between someone who has a deep, earnest desire to address these things, even where it is not personally beneficial, or even where it's personally costly, versus where someone signals that interest, but only actually takes the opportunities that are not personally costly. So I'm bringing this up because you said, what about getting wealthy people to defect on the thing? It's important to know that it really is defect on the thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's important to know what the thing is, what the set of dynamics are well enough that one can be honest about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the next question where you were starting to talk about some kind of secret society or whatever, I can get into, but I don't know if you want to go straight there, if you had a question on anyway I just said.
I do have a question, but it will take us in a different direction. So I do want to double click on secret society.
Okay, so I'm going to share something that's tricky here. Every other week, somebody tells me about the secret society that they're creating. That's going to be like the Masons or whatever, to address these issues. And I'm not saying that that's always a bad idea. I'm saying that there's definitely a lot of awareness that those had been parts of social shifts in the past, and that maybe some group of people that are interacting or bring together groups of people that are interacting in a bonded enough way that they can maybe do something. Like, people have that idea. I think generally there is a much greater depth of understanding of what it would take for that to be effective in theory of change than I see in those who think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So one principle goes, let's say that I'm a person or I'm a group, right? I want to do something really big that I don't currently have the bandwidth to do. I'm trying to take on some load that I don't have the bandwidth for currently. Solve climate change, prevent existential risk, whatever it is, some big thing. And I have very limited bandwidth relative to that whole picture. How will I ever be able to do the thing? Everybody comes to recognize this principle that says if you have very limited bandwidth relative to the load you're trying to move, then you must use your bandwidth in service of creating more bandwidth. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use the little bit of money I have to make more money, to get the amount of money I would need to do the thing. I'm going to use the little amount of network friendship connections I have to start working network dynamics of who they know and can connect me to get more network dynamics. I'm going to use the status I have to build status, whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a totally reasonable and right thought process for how to gain the capacity to do things that you don't currently have the capacity to do. But then as soon as you start to have some success at it, and now you already have some power asymmetry relative to lots of people, and yet maybe not as much as you think you need for the purpose. Now, the previous thing that becomes a problem that we talked about, which is those who have power asymmetry have the incentive and the capacity to continue to further increase that power asymmetry, where that asymmetry of power becomes one of the underlying generators of most of the problems. So there's this tricky thing where so often the people who say or even think that they're oriented to develop power to do the good thing end up becoming sources of lots of the future problems in their process of doing that. And so there is a carefulness that needs to happen. In general, let's say I create an organization and I have full-time employees, and I'm creating this organization to solve some global problem, whatever it is. Well, it's the incentive of all those employees to never solve the problem, which would then have them lose their job, right? If we really solve the problem, it would debase the reason for existence of that organization. And if that organization happens to benefit from, especially not just everyone who has a job, but let's say the organization makes a lot of money, so some people profit on it, or it has some kind of power that some people benefit from, and particularly the people who get to the top of the organization that have the most power are the kinds of people that are good at getting into power positions because they're oriented towards liking power and winning power games, then they benefit so much from the existence of that organization that solving the thing that they supposedly exist to address and losing the power associated would be totally undesirable. So every organization that is designed to solve a problem, but that has a kind of permanence in its structure, has a perverse incentive in its own existence to not debase its own existence, which really solving the problem would do. So it ends up just wanting to manage the problem forever, to justify its ongoing existence, which means that now it has a basis to manufacture the problem and to protect against real solutions. So now look at the UN and look at most big philanthropic groups and look at most big government bodies, and they're still managing the same problems that they were originally created to manage. And usually the problems get worse, right? So the UN was supposed to prevent World War III after we got nukes coming out of World War II. We haven't had World War III in a kinetic warfare sense yet, but nuclear deproliferation was obviously a key goal to that whole system. And we went from, at the creation, one country that had nukes, and then pretty soon 2 countries in a mutually assured destruction, to 9 or so countries that have nukes, and an unknown number of non-state actors that have catastrophic level capacity. We're like, okay, well, we certainly have not succeeded at that thing. Now, is it just because it was hard and we failed, but we really tried our best? Or is it also because the existence of the organization has perverse incentive at its foundation? So these are things one has to actually think about really deeply if they are earnest about wanting to solve problems, as opposed to, I'm going to get with some group and do something that gives us more influence, i.e. power, that we will then benefit from. And what type of attractive basin does that move us into? So now I can say some more things about what it would take to get that right and not wrong. But the first step is realizing that if one isn't thoughtful enough, it's almost certain to go wrong.
Okay, I have a question about earnestness. You're talking. I appreciate how like you're communicating without any sign of rose-colored glasses now. Like you're talking straight. You're talking lucid. It's very realistic, right? You're illuminating the problems that are in play, and I wonder like what your personal sovereignty stack looks like to protect against a dominant cynical worldview, and to what extent personal sovereignty practices should illuminate one's individual responsibility and how much an individual should take on in this life.
I don't have a clear answer for your last question of how much an individual should take on. I don't feel like that can be answered across the board for everybody. I can say some considerations that come to mind for me. For me, there was a sense of care that couldn't turn off or turn away and be okay. and that also couldn't be ineffective and be okay, that created a sense of obligation that I couldn't not do. So there was no outside should. There was a couldn't not focus on these things. I think I would like to encourage people to think about and to reflect on what is it that they feel like they can't actually turn their attention away from, what they can't avoid being of service to and actually feel congruent with their own self. Where turning away from that or being less effectively of service has them out of congruency with their own self. And then the path is, what does it take to become more congruent with my own self? And the sovereignty practices you're talking about both involve increasing our capacities, develop new skills, develop new relationships, develop new knowledge and understanding so that I can be more effective. And notice where I'm holding internal incongruencies and work to resolve those and look at what the basis of them is. So I'll give an example of a process someone could walk through to explore this. Someone could spend some time in deep reflection where the pull of what's next isn't overwhelming their ability to go deeper. And they could ask themselves, what is it that I care? What do I care about? And why do I care about it? What do I care most about? What on my deathbed will I care most about? And will I feel most proud of and was a right use of my life? And what will I wish that I had engaged in differently? It's even deeper, what is sacred to me that is worthy of the devotion of my life? And what is worth more to me than my own life? And why? And not just think about it, but feel it. Feel the situations in which one would sacrifice life and or quality of life for something that matters more and where that comes from. And then write about it. And write what is sacred and what my values are, what my highest values are. That's the first part. The next part would be reflect and write on what do I understand to be the current situation of the world? What are the main problems in the world? What are some of the biggest and most pressing problems as I understand them? What are the environmental issues? What are the human rights and social justice issues? What are the animal welfare issues? What are the risk of refugee warfare, AI weapons, whatever, right? Just really think about that. So those two things give you, what do I care most about and what is the world I actually live in today? And then the third part is, given those two things, what should I be doing in my life in this world, not a different world that I don't live in, not the world of 1950s or a world I hope for, or the world of delusion because I'm not paying attention to the world I live in, or the world of obligations that isn't connected to what I care most about. And I don't mean the right obligations, I mean the bullshit obligations. What we should actually be obligated to is an important question, which has to do with that first question. So ask, if this is really what I value and this is the world I'm in, how should I be living to be in relationship to the actual world I'm in, aligned with my own values? Just nobody else's should, my own congruency with myself. What would that life look like? And there might be plenty of parts where you don't know, because you don't know the state of the world assessment well enough or what the opportunities are, but you'll at least have some things that are clear. And the first thing might be, I would be finding out what the best projects are that are working on these things, and if they're adequate and I can just add my life service to them, or if they're not adequate and I need to help figure out what to do or whatever, right? Then once you have a sense of what your life would be if you were congruent with your own values in the world that is, then look at what your life currently is and look at what is the gap, what's the delta between the way you're living and the way you would be living to be of maximum congruence with your own self. And ask, why is that gap there? What is it that is driving my current behavior other than my values? Is it that I don't take enough time to be clear on the world that I'm in? Is it that I feel disempowered, so I turn away? Is it that I shut off a whole chunk of my emotions because I feel so overwhelmed by the state of the world? Is it that I have let myself be too bound to loyalties and obligations and duties that are not actually mine? Is it that I'm afraid? Is it that there's a wounded ego that is still trying to prove that I'm enough by acquiring more money or more status or whatever it is, to somehow like narcissistically self-serve to prove that I'm lovable or something like that? What is it? And it's going to not be one thing, it'll be a bunch of things. Then your personal development that is most important is clearing those things. It's addressing what you need to address that is driving the gap between what your own life of maximum congruence would be and the way you're currently living. And if that means that there are unresolved insecurities that have you still compensating, doing some type of performance compensation to address those insecurities, it means do the healing work to resolve those. And if it is that you feel overwhelmed and you don't feel like you have the agency, then start the kind of development work that increases your sense of agency and your ability to stay present in the presence of fear and sadness and anger and large emotions. Your ability to feel them without shutting down or getting controlled or taken over by the emotion, etc. So I would say that the personal development that is most important is the personal development that comes from assessing what is in the way of me living my own dharma the most clearly. So you actually start with the assessment of what my dharma is. And the dharma is the alignment between what you value and the world that you're in to be what is yours to do. I think that that approach to personal development is different in kind than the approach that is focused on what will make me happier. Mm-hmm. And in a way that not only cultivates better humans and even happier humans, but is also more effective. Some of our patterns are deep enough that what it takes to shift them is hard enough that we actually need something that matters to us more than our own life to solve them. Mm-hmm. So on the topic of how much someone should take on, I would say this reflection process might give people an insight into that for themselves. I'd also say then, let's say that someone is weightlifting. As they lift more weights, they become capable of lifting more weights. There's a growth process that occurs. As somebody studies more math, they become capable of doing more math. There's development that occurs. And so I can't see someone that's doing huge things in the world and resonate and say, I want to do that, and just think that I can just start doing that without going through the development that it takes. So if I see the big dude in the gym squatting 500 pounds and I'm like, I want to squat 500 pounds, so I just go get under the bar, all that's going to happen is I'm going to herniate my back. I'm not actually going to do the thing properly, right? So it's like, sure, I can do that if I want. But to do that properly and with good form, I have to start where I'm at. And so how much should someone take on? Well, the amount that they can that is growing them. And then grow. I think the scope of the issues that we're all able to think about and care about is big enough relative to the relatively small agency to actually make sense of what it would take to solve them and what we feel like we can do, that a lot of people just go into overwhelm and then they turn to entertainment or distraction or whatever, or they turn to personal development as the idea, well, at least maybe I'm projecting my need for healing on the world and I just need to grow.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that there's no truth to that, but that can also be a bypass. Spirituality itself can be a spiritual bypass of the calling to serve.
Mm-hmm.
It is that we aren't just a isolated spirit or being, like we're actually a part of a world. And any spirituality that doesn't look at how we are a part of that world and the service of our life to life itself is a shit spirituality. A question of what do I do to support my increasing sense of agency and capacity to be able to look at the world in a sober way and not have to pretend that shit is better than it is for my own psychological well-being, not turn away from issues, but also not go numb or be broken by it. The first thing is just a commitment that all of those other answers are unacceptable to me. So turning away from the reality of the world means fragmenting myself. Like, if what is more important to me than my life is life with a capital L, not just my experience, but the experience of all sentient things now and into perpetuity, then to turn away from any of their experience because it's overwhelming, meaning I'm saying my experience can't handle looking at the reality of their experience, means that I'm actually not in devotion to what is sacred to me. I'm not actually treating what is more important in my life as if it is, and my life isn't in right relationship and service. So that answer doesn't work. Going numb means fragmenting my own internal self, right? So either I fragment myself off from the world, or I fragment part of myself off because I can't actually stay with the feeling. Feeling righteous and outraged and angry in a way that doesn't do anything that's effective, I'm actually just not willing to be ineffective. Like, I don't want to feel, I think a lot of people mistake wanting to feel like they're making a difference and actually making a difference. I actually don't care about feeling like I am if I'm not. So the kind of righteous indignation that comes from thinking I'm on the right side while I'm clearly pursuing a strategy that will fail, I can't find any ability to be with that. So how to, just trusting that other people will figure it out. I've talked to too many of the people that are in the positions of most power in the world and et cetera, and I know they aren't figuring it out. So I also can't sit with the solution of, well, I'll just work on my little corner of the thing and trust that other people will figure it out, because I know it's not true. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other people who are endeavoring in this way, but it definitely means that it's not already a sealed deal where the probability of us succeeding isn't influenced by the way I can show up.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean the kind of hubris to say, I have to solve the thing and there's nobody else. It doesn't mean that. But it also doesn't mean the kind of laziness that says, oh, life will fix itself as an emergent property and somehow I'm out of that. Right? So it's, how do I take responsibility to be of service to all I care about as best I can? And how do I continue to grow what as best I can is? So if I have that frame of all of the other modes that I'm not willing to go into, then I have to say, okay, so to stay in the place where I'm looking at reality and I can look at it clearly and I cannot be, and I can actually feel the feelings that are there, feel the emotions that are there, and I can stay with those feelings and not be collapsed by them. And I can see the inadequacy of the strategies that would allow me to be part of existing groups as the whole of what I do. So I have to actually be engaged in earnestly trying to figure shit out, not just taking an answer that somebody else has figured out. So then whatever work needs to be done, so it's like, okay, sometimes it's important to feel the emotions of heartbreak and devastation, anger, fear, whatever, fully. To actually give yourself space to just feel them fully and cry, scream, whatever. Don't do that in the place where you're supposed to be doing strategy or operations. Give yourself space to be with the emotion, because trauma fucks strategy up. And so we can see groups that respond out of collective trauma and end up doing bad strategy that makes them anti beneficial to the actual success of the thing that they want to serve. But you also can't pretend it's not there. So you need to make a space to process trauma, to process emotion. Otherwise, a numbness starts to occur, and then you're actually losing one of the types of your intelligence, one of the types of sensitivity and feedback, as well as one of the places where your actual motive comes from. So you need some space to feel it. And then to say, okay, the reason that I'm so fucking pissed about this, or the reason that I feel so heartbroken about it or scared of this thing happening, is because there is something that I love enough to feel that. I'm only afraid of something that I really love and care about possibly being hurt. I'm only angry when there's something I really love and care about that I find beautiful, that I find worthwhile, meaningful, where I'm focused on who's harming it. I'm only heartbroken when I'm looking at something harmed that I really care about. So if I didn't care, if there wasn't a deep love for the Amazon or the animals or the people over there or the whatever it was, I wouldn't feel anything at them being destroyed. I'd just be apathetic and I'd say, whatever, burn it down. The apathy comes from numbing to where I can't actually feel the love anymore because I couldn't handle being with the pain that was associated with it. Mm-hmm. But I want to take the fear, the anger, the devastation and trace it back to, it's actually because I really fucking think those whales are incredible beings, and I don't know what their experience of life is, but I value it. I appreciate it. I want them to keep living. It's because I think the oceans and life is beautiful. It's because I think that mothers falling in love with their kids in the future is fucking beautiful, and the capacity for human life to continue to advance is meaningful to me. It's because I love those things enough that I'm bothered where they are being harmed or could be harmed. But then the bothered is focused on what I don't want, not what I do, and what I can't do about it rather than what I can. So it is a response to love, but it's usually an unconscious and disempowered response to love. So I want to trace it back to the love and then say, what is it that I want to see happen there? What would be in service to the protection and the benefit of what I love? And what could I do to be in service of it? And so then fearful turns into careful, full of care rather than full of fear. Mm. And angry turns into passionate. And heartbroken turns into like a depth of connection and sweetness and gratitude and commitment, meaningfulness of what's there. So space to feel the feelings, like looking at reality and seeing it, space to feel the feelings that are there, tracing it to what is really loved and cared about, coming to what it is that I want to see happen, coming to what I can do about it, and then empowering myself in terms of the way I take care of my body. So I have more physical power in my body that also affects my psyche, in terms of the relationships that I have, in terms of the way I learn about the issues so I understand how to address them better. I have better sensemaking, in terms of the way I increase my skills and capacity to do something, so I get to see that I'm actually doing something and growing in my capacity. Those things.
There's a distinction between being with reality as it is and then getting lost in fantasy and using sort of idealized versions of yourself and others in the future as kind of a balm of some sort. Um, I wonder how you piece apart the capacity to truly be with what is, while at the same time holding some version of the future that you see possible without it turning into pure fantasy, because you're holding something that's not in existence while simultaneously holding reality as it is. You're working with reality towards some version in the future.
This is why these conversations so often go in the direction of people's thoughts on human nature
Mm.
and what is genetic predisposition and what are the upper bounds of what humans are really capable of, and what of the things that suck are animalistically predisposed. And so then obviously a lot of people in modern environments start talking about CRISPR based, biogenetic solutions, um, because we want to say with the physical resources the world actually has. So without Star Trek replicators that we don't have, and with the timelines we have factoring current issues, which is not forever, with the number of people that we have, with the forces that are arrayed against, and with what seems to be human predisposition within these systems, but then also what we can best assess as nature that is unavoidable regardless of predisposing circumstance, what is actually possible, right? If you're trying to move the world from where it is to a different world, you have some sense of what different world is, and you want to make sure that it's a grounded sense, right? That the there point is a real there point, not a made up there point. And so for me, like in terms of study of human nature, it was a lot of things like, okay, I want to look at all of the cultures that I can get any meaningful insider data on, um, that were the least violent, and the cultures that had the longest periods of civilizational success without collapse in what they were doing, and the ones that had the highest level of education or quality of life, or various things like this. I want to do positive deviant analysis on the things that are in the right direction, to see that what humans seem to be capable of, that is not just based on imagination. And then maybe different cultures succeeded in different areas. I want to see, if I look at the positive deviance in different areas that matter, is what it takes to condition some of those mutually exclusive with what it takes to condition others, or could we make a civilization in which those several different positive things that we've seen could be developed in some groups of humans, could that be developed simultaneously, right? Like these types of inquiries. I also then want to come back and see, how much have I been able to change things that I really wanted to change, and how much have I seen other people be able to change patterns of behavior, worldview, etc., to have a sense of, and how much have I been able to create projects that actually were able to fulfill things that I hoped that they would fulfill. So I want to look both at the kind of epistemic basis of what I think is possible, and see that what I think is possible is actually based on some reality. And then I also want to try doing real things and get empirical feedback. And if they aren't succeeding, try again, and be able to, again, also have the empirical feedback of what is possible, informing, and not just what's currently happening, but also the rate of how I'm getting better at it or not, right? To be able to forecast what is possible. There's lots of kinds of things that I want to see in the world that I believe are possible, but that I don't think will happen while I'm alive.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean that I think they'll ever happen if we aren't working effectively towards them now. And so, also what is possible, what does it take to bring about what is possible, is another important question.
Mm. Okay, I want to be sensitive to your time, and maybe leave you with just one more question. The game B meme is generating some interest. to maybe a resurgence of interest since you first began. I'm curious if you have any advice or wisdom in regard to how to orient oneself around a meme and how to protect against capture or corruption. Yeah, well, like what are your hopes and wishes for this idea, for this game B idea?
So first, it's important to state that the term game B came about from a project that Jordan Hall and Jim Rutt and some other people initiated, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that at Santa Fe Institute. I wasn't part of that group. So I don't know, um, a lot of what went on beyond some stories that I've heard. That had actually completed a cycle when Jordan and I met each other. And then some of the other people that were involved, I met through him after the fact. And I had been involved in some similar kinds of projects. And we both learned from our successes and failures in them and, started kind of anew. And so now there is a kind of public resurgence of Game B. I think Jim put up, a Facebook page and being talked about on more podcasts like that. How do you resist capture and corruption? Well, the first part is to at least know that that is an inevitable force the moment you put a flag on the map.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The moment you name the thing and the thing seems like people are attracted and interested, then it becomes a honeypot for people who want to be part of something that seems like it's growing. Either just people that want to have inclusion and belonging, or want to have safety and being part of an in-group of a different kind, or that want to be leaders in something that seems like the future or whatever. So to know that the honeypot effect is a thing, to know that capture the flag is a thing, the orientation for people to try and do that, which is how do I, to the degree this thing seems like people are resonating with it, how do I steer it in the direction of what my own interests are? How do I seem like the smart contributor or whatever it is in the group to raise my social status? Like, just be aware of those phenomena. Be aware of them in yourself and be aware of them in others. And to the degree that the whole group can be informed of that, well, and have some processes to be more reflective in oneself of where one is coming from. And then more noticing and corrective of things that they see happening in the group dynamics, at least. So this is basically have the public education, right? Have the public education and development of those in the group be such that you can notice the types of forces that lead to problems and corruption and whatever, and be able to address them. There isn't a systemic way to ensure that they won't occur. Because if we're trying to empower everyone's sense making and everyone's choice making, the reality of people having choice is that they can make shitty choices. And they have whatever basis for choice making they have coming in, which includes all the beautiful virtues and all of the bad conditionings, habits, addictions, and traumas, and rationalizations and whatever else. So I would say just being pretty acutely, ongoingly aware and monitoring, starting with oneself. That would be one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not being attached to a meme is another really important one. So the Tao that is nameable is not the eternal Tao. And the moment you have a model or concept of reality, it's no longer reality. The moment you have a concept of what the right future will be, it's actually dead. So we can say Game B is the moment that is a solid statement, it's wrong. So if it can be more process oriented, right? If it can be more of a verb that says it is a inquiry, it's an ongoing inquiry into what effective civilization might be like. And in that inquiry so far, here's some of the thinking that has happened. And here's all of the space of thinking that is in process. And insofar as we have some insights on what we think effective civilization will be, which is how do humans interact with other humans towards shared purposes, are we in this group that is endeavoring to inquire into that practicing being citizens of that civilization and how we're engaging with each other? So how can we dog food that kind of process? And other groups that don't call themselves game B or identify with it, but clearly have some shared aspects of sense making or ethos or whatever, be also just as interested in those, independent of different flags.
Thanks, Daniel. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for, I mean, I don't know you well, but I feel like this podcast is partly your feeling into what is yours to do. And part of that was both understanding more on your own and helping others to do that so they can all be more oriented in the direction of Dharma, new civilization creation. And, this is a type of public education.
Mm.
That's why I say yes to these things, is because given that we don't have schools or news that are effective, this kind of is some of the best avenues we have at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I applaud your efforts in that direction and enjoyed the conversation.